Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. We're here for our fourth. Oh, I'm getting a little feedback. For everybody in the room, if you're on Zoom, please mute your mics and also turn off your speakers. I'll have to remember that too. I sometimes screw that up. Again, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our fourth technical advisory group tag meeting for our MATES study, our multiple air toxics exposures study. See, we have a good attendance on the Zoom, and we got a few people here in room. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We do this before all of our meetings. And so I'm just kind of up a little script I'm going to go through here. We do have three formats for participation. We have in person, of course, Zoom and teleconference. If you're attending in person, we ask that you try not to connect to Zoom unless you really need to. But if you do, again, please mute everything while you're here in the meeting room. Please silence all communication devices to prevent disruption during the meeting. All participants on Zoom, except for panelists, will be placed on mute by the host. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. After each agenda item, the tag members and the public will have a chance to provide feedback and ask questions. The Q&A button in Zoom can also be used for public comment at any time during the meeting. Although if the hands go up during a presentation, often we'll wait till we get to the end of the presentation for questions. And for those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment, please use that raise hand button. Depending on your version of Zoom, the raise hand button will be visible after pressing the react button. For those calling in by phone, you can dial *9 to signal you would like to comment. Your name or part of your phone number will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Please note, you can hang up and/or leave the Zoom meeting at any time. Of course, like with all meetings, please treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. For those in the room, the nearest restrooms are located back there to my left. You keep going through both doors and then off to the left, you'll find restrooms there. And in case anything happens, if we need to evacuate, follow AQMD staff to the muster area. Lastly, please be aware that this video conference meeting is being recorded. By participating in this meeting hosted by South Coast AQMD, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD. Okay, so all that stuff aside, again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. We only have two items, but they're media items that we have on this agenda for today. One thing I did want to note here is we've had, I think, again, this is our fourth tag meeting. I know there's sometimes other conversations that happen too, which is great. This might be our last tag meeting for a little while. I think that the idea right now is that we want to collect a bunch of data and then come back with that, but that's going to be a little while. So it might be a year plus, probably will be a year plus until we ask for another meeting of the tag membership to all get together. If something comes up, of course, we always reserve the right to say, hey, let's all get together. We need to talk about something, but this probably will be the last time for a little while. With that, I think we've gone through introductions before. I don't know that we necessarily need to do that this time, but if you do have a question or you want to speak, maybe just introduce yourself before you speak and say your affiliation so that we know where you're from. And I think that will be really helpful. Okay, so I think with that, we can probably get on to the main reason we're here, which is to not listen to me, but to listen to others. And so we have our first presentation on agenda item 2. And I'm happy that we have Nick Molden here, who's going to speak. And Nick, actually, where are you going to speak from? Did you want to speak from the lectern? Okay, we can do that. And he's going to talk about this brake and tire wear component of the study that we're looking to do.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone can hear me clearly. Thanks very much for inviting me here to talk about the technical proposal behind the brake and tire wear exposure project as part of MATE 6 across the South Basin and Coachella Valley. I mean, first of all, I want to say I'm very excited to be working together on this project, and I've got about 30 minutes to present to you the essentials of the technical program, and then happy to take as many questions as you've got. I'm founder and chief executive of Emissions Analytics, and also an honorary senior research fellow at Imperial College in London. What I wanted to cover this morning were these 6 items, really setting out at a high level from essentially what we're trying to do, who's doing it, what's the timing, how AQMD will be, we're going to be working together closely on this, and to summarize the objectives and the tasks. So first of all, overview, the 3 essential things that we're trying to do here is to take environmental samples and identify and quantify tire and brake wear concentrations in those samples. And then use those measurements and add them to the air quality traffic dispersion modeling at a fine level of spatial resolution, and also to improve the uncertainties on previous work. And then the third thing, as a result of that, to estimate the airborne concentrations and the human health risks associated with that. Throughout, and because essentially this is quite a fast evolving area, tire and brake wear emissions, non-exhaust emissions generally, there's a huge amount of work going on at the moment. There's lots of different methodologies, approaches being developed. So throughout this, we will be very transparent about the methods that we're using and the rationale for that, and evidence their robustness, and set a platform for being able to reproduce those measurements and use these sorts of methods for future work. So moving on to the team. So in bidding for this contract, we brought together what we think is a really strong combination of people. So from Emissions Analytics, I will be overall in charge of the project, supported by my lead chemist, Ime Usen, PhD chemist, who will be primarily running the organic sampling, organic analysis of the samples. James Holland will be overall in charge of the data handling, because we'll be taking obviously lots of samples from lots of different locations. The custody and of those samples and the integrity of that data is absolutely central, and that's James's primary role. Then we're very happy to be working with UC Irvine and Jim Smith and Anne-Marie, who's here in the room today. Jim will be focusing particularly on developing the brake wear part and the brake wear fingerprinting part of this process. Anne-Marie will be leading the modeling side of it, and which is a combination of different techniques that will be used, and we'll come on to a bit later. And Jicheng Zhang from University of Southern California will be aiding, who's ex-California Air Resources Board, will be aiding in that process as well. And there'll be a team underlying us, supporting us in the work as well. Very roughly, just to give you a shape of this, before I go into greater detail, just so we get an idea of what is happening when. Essentially, the remainder of this year will be the project setup and the literature review element of it. 2025 will be first and foremost the actual primary sampling from all the monitoring stations. That may leak slightly into 2026, but that's what 2025 is primarily about. Leading then into 2026, which will focus much more on the modeling and analysis side. And then from 27 onwards, that'll be led by the reporting, the outreach, the comms, and particularly then the factoring into the wider MATES program. More specifically, pulling out from the actual proposal, the sort of 6 key milestones and their deadlines. So the first deadline being November this year, which is about presenting the technical proposal, of which this today is part of that, but also documenting some of the core analytical processes, including the organic analysis process that we will be using. By March, we need to have completed the literature review and the overall sampling project plan. then by April 2026, all the samples and should have been taken in and analyzed. By March 2027, that is the time where we would expect to have all the calculations of the emissions and the concentrations completed by, if not quite substantially earlier, but that is the backstop delivery date. By July 27, then following from that, the modeling and emissions development and the whole backstop on the project, July 28, to complete everything else. As part of this, it's been inherently structured that we'll be working hand in hand with AQMD, and that is for a number of reasons, not least that what we're doing isn't some completely separate project which delivers something and then hands over the results. It's to be able to dovetail very carefully and closely into the MATES sticks program. And so AQMD support in this is essential. What that will involve is providing 600 filter samples over the sampling period, which is currently slated to start from January 2025. AQMD will also be doing some ICP-MS analysis in its laboratories, which will particularly feed into the breakware analysis side. In addition, some VOC and semi-volatile carbonyl analysis measurements. Then when it comes to the modeling side, this is where, again, we will be working closely to make sure the output data from it feeds in neatly into the overall MATES 6 work. We will be using the same types of emissions factors, say MFAC and the vehicle activity data that is well known, recognized to you. So we're not going out on a limb and using completely different approaches. It'll be trying to go with the grain as much as possible of what you already do. We'll also, there will be a small part of it which will also, where you will help by analyzing the hexavalent chromium that we will be able to see from the filters as well. And then there will be in the background the data transfer. So ultimately you will end up with all the relevant data from these analyses on your servers. So moving on then to the specific objectives. So there are 4 specific objectives here. And this reflects what's in the contract. So objective 1 is essentially to create a database of substances that are in brake and tire emissions. The tire emissions part of that is largely complete already from prior work that we have done. So we have so far analyzed over 500 different tires, just under half of which are specific US tires. So we come to this project already with a very deep understanding of the substances that are inside tires. We're at an earlier stage with brakes. And so as part of this project will involve the development of the equivalent database of brake substances. And that is what Jim Smith at UCI will be leading in his lab. A crucial part of this, and as part of the deliverables, will be able to delineate between brake and tire substances. So we are not coming up with overall non-exhaust emissions factors which are lumped together, but it will separate out those two. The chemical signatures from those two groups are quite different anyway, so that's going to be a tractable problem. Then what we would, the third part of objective 1 is to bring together, to compile a list of compounds which have OEHA inhalation factors. So what do we know today? What already exists in terms of those health factors? But we fully expect to see a large number of compounds for which those factors do not already exist. So the question is then, how we handle those. Now, it's not within the scope of this project then to go and develop those factors. That would be a much more extensive process. But what this will do is identify those factors which don't have these health factors, which then might tee up, right, or would lead us then to discuss how we might understand the risk factors from those compounds. That lies outside of the scope of this project technically, but we will help inform you as to which compounds we're seeing that are quite prevalent, but for which you do not have these inhalation factors. Moving on to the second objective. So this is doing all the measurements from the sampling station. So 10 sampling stations across the South Coast Air Basin and the Coachella Valley on a 1 in 6. 1 in 6 time frame. So that's how we get to the 600 over the year. So 10 stations, 1 in 6 over a year-long period. We will then, those will go for analysis in our organic labs for the metals analysis, and we will be then putting that together with the OHIHA cancer potency factors and reference exposure levels. And you, by that 1 in 6 sampling rate, so 1 in every 6 days, essentially, that's the level of quite detailed temporal resolution we will get from this part of the project. Objective 3 is then to estimate the ambient concentrations attributable to the brake and tire emissions from on-road vehicles at a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer spatial resolution, always sitting within the wider MATES 6 program and coordinating with the modeling techniques that AQMD is already using, and using those cancer and non-cancer exposure risks that we've already talked about. One thing to flag, obviously with tire emissions particularly, and to some extent with brakes as well, on a filter paper from a monitoring station, we will be getting primary tire emissions, so come directly from the tire, suspended in the air, sample onto the filter paper, but also resuspended tire particles, so from some prior vehicle where it's fallen to the carriageway and then got resuspended by a later vehicle and then onto the filter paper. So the total amounts that we will be seeing for both tires and brakes will be the sum of those two elements, and that's was what was required in the tender document. But crucially, it will, by doing this chemical analysis process, will allow not only the distinction of brakes from tires, but also brakes and tires from other emission sources as well. So material that has blown in from some industrial source or some agricultural source, the expectation is to be able to differentiate that from the on-road brake and tire sources. The last part of this will be then putting that together with the effectively the fleet and traffic data and the SCAG activity data to get an idea, then putting that together with the monitoring stations and the temporal resolution to get an idea of the dependencies between the fleet and the activity and the concentrations being observed. So that's the last part of objective 3. And then finally, objective 4 essentially means you have and others have some brake and emissions factors already, but frankly, they have very wide uncertainties. And across the world as well, thinking a broader perspective, the uncertainties around these measurements are very high at the moment. So one of the core objectives of this is that we will undoubtedly come out with numbers, but we need to be able to express those uncertainties and show that those uncertainties are now significantly reduced from previous work. That's inherent in the approach here. So that's the 4 objectives. That then manifests itself as 11 different tasks. And I'm not planning to go through 11 tasks in detail, but what I am going to do is pick on a small number of those just to give you a flavor of some of the more sort of technically meaty ones, which you may well have some comments and thoughts on. Task 1 is today, and the work we will be doing immediately afterwards to report on our organic analysis methodology, which will be the sort of publicly stated method. Number 2, literature review will be number 2. We've talked about that a bit earlier, writing the project plan. Task 4 is essentially preparing and training. So when we do start taking these measurements next year from the sampling stations, the process is really smooth. The whole data handling integrity is spot on. And then task 5 is when we get into the analysis of the air samples. Task 6 is the compilation of the breakware compound database. So that's what Jim Smith will be leading at UCI. Task 7, the calculation of the break and tire concentrations using the fingerprinting method. And that's one of the ones I'm going to come on to in a second. The modeling and emissions development, which Anne-Marie will be leading using CMAC, AirMod, R-Line, etc. Task 9 then gets into the reporting, data transfer. Task 10, presenting that technical report, looking for peer review and publication, and maximum outward engagement. And finally, number 11, which is essentially will give to AQMD a license to use the data we previously collected on tire compounds for future use. And that's one which is what I was talking about earlier, in that this will allow you to do similar work in the future using the same methodology for the purposes of continuity and intertemporal comparison. So that's the 11 in total, but drilling into just a small number of those. So task 2, the literature review, well, we actually, emissions analytics, we not only do we track all the peer-reviewed scientific literature already on this, and roughly speaking, there's about 1 academic paper that's published per day at the moment around the world. Quite a lot of it comes out of China at the moment, and there's a lot of really interesting work going on. So it's very current. It's a very complex area, and that's why it's good that there are so many researchers now around the world working on this to break this complex problem down. But we are, as a matter of course, we are tracking all that academic literature anyway. In addition, actually, we do run something called the Tire Emissions Research Consortium, which is an online group, which is a place, effectively a discussion forum around these. So we do have a good connection into researchers around the world. Sorry, thanks. And just to give you an idea of what that yields, I suppose to give you an idea of our level of knowledge about what's in tires. In our literature review so far and our own analysis work, we have so far found 15,916 unique organic compounds in tires across the hundreds that we've tested. There are quite a lot of common compounds, and I've pulled out just 6 here, which are ones that are both common and should be of significant interest from a human health point of view. But that's 6 of almost 16,000, which tells you there's a very long tail of these organic compounds in these really complex products. And we need to be always mindful, I think, of relatively low concentration, but high potential toxicity compounds. So we don't just go to the big ones. We also are mindful of that long tail as well. So message here is we do it today as a reality, but also have an ambition to understand these substances at that level of detail. Task 5, this is our how we do the organic analysis. So we do as a company, we do a number of processes on tires, including the off-gassing of VOCs from the surface of tires, which is not a primary part of this project, but will play a bit part. The primary one is the top left, which is the pyrolysis GC-GC TOF-MS process. So our knowledge is built from taking original tires and using 2-dimensional gas chromatography and an understanding of breakdown products and reaction products through a pyrolysis process to work backwards to what is actually in those original tires. So in a sense, that's the foundation stone of our knowledge. This is the equipment we use. And the reason we chose two-dimensional gas chromatography is that so much of what's in tires are the higher molecular weight organic compounds, which are not separated adequately by single-dimensional gas chromatography. So by adding that second dimension, we're able to do that separation. The TOF-MS allows for a high level of sensitivity and an ability to identify all those, or very large number of those compounds, at least up to C40. And then we can also do the quantitation as well. But I fully recognize that this goes beyond what is currently enshrined in ASTM or ISO standards. I mean, they do exist for single-dimensional gas chromatography, but that only takes you so far. The way we will be able to reduce the uncertainties here is by the introduction of this second dimension. But as it's not been standardized yet by any third party, what we have done is worked with the main metrology organization in the United Kingdom, the National Physical Laboratory, to do a detailed review, including an uncertainty analysis on our method. So that to give us, when we started, a confidence that our method was delivering what it proposed to do and with a level of accuracy and precision that was sufficient. So that exists, and I can always share with you more details on that. Ultimately, though, to look at it visually, you get a two-dimensional chromatogram, and this is a real tire, and it gives you two things. One, you can see how many compounds can actually be seen in tires, but also why two dimensions is important. If you collapse that down to one single dimension, you can see quite easily from that how many peaks would be co-eluting. And so you would have a problem in identification. And why I'm laboring this slightly is that having that ability to separate is then the key to the fingerprinting method, which will then allow the quantification of the amount of tire material on the filter paper, with better uncertainties than previous processes. And this, just to give you an idea here, all this pre-exists on the tires side. So this is knowledge that we bring to this process and that we've been developing over the last 5 years. So we've been working at this level of detail on this particular problem of understanding tires for many years now. So that's the tire side. On to the brake side. So essentially what we're doing, if you recall, is we're trying to mimic what we've done on tires on brakes and bring that up to the same position so we can do a fingerprinting method on the brake side as well. So at UCI, there is, so we are actually going to be running abrasion experiments, creating brake particles, then analyzing them using ICP-MS to create a database of the compounds that we see in brakes. So this will be one of the things which happens relatively early on in the project to develop that database and therefore facilitate the fingerprinting methodology later on, which is the fingerprinting is task 7 that I put here. So essentially, we have already analyzed the tires using the 2D GCMS. We will take these filter papers from the sampling stations and we will subject it to exactly the same pyrolysis 2D GCMS process. So you've got exact comparability. So even where there may be some breakdown products, we would expect those to apply the same to both the reference and the sample. So then the comparison can be made. But beyond that, once we have that, and we'll typically find 410 compounds, that's what we find on average for tires. Then the fingerprinting process that we develop with MPL is identifying in that sea of data what the relevant compounds are. And from our database, we will develop what I put in inverted commas here, a California tire or a California brake. So using the intelligence we already have, we'll be able to come up with what is a representative chemical fingerprint of a tire on the roads of Southern California. With that, so we then compare what we see in the sample to that average Californian tire, and the algorithm then enables us to calculate what proportion of the mass we see on this filter paper is likely to be from tires. And the last stage then is to use a Monte Carlo method to estimate the uncertainties around that value. And exactly the same approach would be done on the brakes side as well, but obviously using the brake database as the reference. And the final one is the modeling and emissions development. I wasn't going to go into a huge amount of detail on these slides on what is, a complex combination of different elements, but Anne-Marie is here to field questions to anyone who has them. But essentially, you can see here how we're bringing together CMAC, AirMod, R-Line, and a deep learning regression model to come up with these high resolution emissions estimates and concentrations. You'll see the color coding there, where the ones AQMD effectively will be providing the sort of the base case at the top, and then we will be leading on the ones identified in blue. So in summary, and conscious I'm 1 minute over, so is that, the way I would describe this, and this is a quite extensive program, but it's an innovative approach to a complex problem, and comes at a really good time in terms of concern about a lack of good information on the environmental and health effects of brake and tire emissions. So if we do this according to plan, this should be a sort of significant advance in knowledge, and also, hopefully a significant contributor to the MATES program. As I say, it's a 4-year program, but a lot of the measurement action will happen as early as next year. And we're going with the grain and fitting in with how you work already. And also throughout, we will be very transparent about the methodology and make sure it's not just a one-off interesting project. It gives you a foundation that other work and robust time series of measurements are eminently possible. So on that note, thank you very much for listening, and I'm all yours to field any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. Really appreciate it. So we do have some questions that are coming in on the Q&A and then some hands raised, but I definitely want to open it up first to the tag to have discussion and the things that you want to raise, whether on Zoom or here in person. So we'll start first. It looks like you're
Good morning. Yeah. I apologize for coming in a little late, but one of the interesting topics here that you brought up and what I can see from the presentation, would it be safe to say that if these tires are running through a medium of organic molecules from emissions that are probably contributing to the chemical reactions causing the 15,000 plus dangerous different chemicals that are being created, would it be a safe assumption to make that the cleaner we can get the air, the less emissions that come from the cars themselves, that there will be less chemical reactions and possibly a decrease in the number of dangerous chemicals that are produced from tire waste as we reduce pollution on the roads?
So it's a good question, and we don't know. No one knows definitively what the answer to that question is, but we do have some clues as to what's going on, and there are undoubtedly interactions between tire particles and, say, for example, tailpipe emissions. Not just chemical reactions, but also where the tire particles are providing a vector for transporting tailpipe VOCs much greater distances or being a vector for those into the soil and food chain. So we have interactions on those sorts of levels. So to the degree to which we can, so those two things are interdependent and feed off one another, both in chemically and physically. And so essentially in reducing both sides of it, that can help to contribute to better air quality. But I wouldn't also underestimate the potential for, and I know this is somewhat outside of the scope of this specific project, but from how we see ultimately how to improve the environmental and health impact, quite a lot of it rests on reformulating the tires in the first place. And what I would put forward there is that we can see that the chemical composition of different tires from brand to brand and model to model can be really quite different. There's a lot of heterogeneity in what makes up a tire. And there are some that are much less bad than others. If you just take 6 ppd in the coho salmon problem, the concentration of 6 ppd varies hugely between different brands of tire. So while for the purposes of this and coming up with the macro estimates, we are taking an average Californian tire, we also should be mindful of actually there's a lot of variation within that as well. And to reduce environmental impact, there's a lot we can do there as well. So hopefully that's yeah.
Great, thanks. Anything else in the room before I turn to Zoom? Lakshmi, I don't think you're on the tag. I want to get to the tag first, then I'll definitely come back to you, okay? Great. Okay, I see some hands raised. I'm just going to go in the order that I see on my screen. So Phil Hopke.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. You know, there are, particularly on the brake side, it's my understanding that there are lots and lots. I mean, you talk about the variations in tires. There's a lot of post-market brake pads with a wide variety of materials in them. And the question then is, how stable is that mixture so that, you know, if you take a snapshot set of samples and analyze them, we have any feeling at all for how applicable that's going to be for how much time? And are samples you take now applicable to the cars that are on the road that may have had their brake pads put in anywhere up to, you know, 10 or 15 years ago? Well, it wouldn't be that long, but at least 3 or 5 years ago.
Yes, so the answer there is, again, we don't know, but we need to find out, or at least a good idea early on. So one of the first things I will be looking for from the brake testing is what level of heterogeneity we do actually find. And that will then inform the further, essentially, sampling. We do also need to think about, we need to try and anchor the choice of brake pads to those which are the big selling ones in the market.
Sure.
So I can't answer you right now, but that's the process that we will go through to try and understand and to be able to answer the question, then come up with a meaningful reference database of brake compounds. If it's anything like tires, and I guess my base case is that we're going to see a lot of heterogeneity as well. In which case, then we need to make sure we have the right spread, and spread not just in terms of brand, but also spread in terms of age. So essentially, our early findings will inform our latter sampling choices.
Yeah, I just was wondering whether it might even be sensible to try and get some people's old used brake pads. You know, when go to a garage that's doing a lot of brake repairs and grabbing some of those as a basis for what was compositions. The other main question I had was, you know, different repair parts obviously have substantially different costs. And so you wonder about the heterogeneity of, or the homogeneity in different areas of the sampled area where, where in some of the lower SES areas, you would have cheaper materials and therefore a different mix of toxic materials versus more affluent suburbs and things like that. And is there any way we can get at whether lower cost products are producing more toxic materials, both in tires and in the brake materials?
Yes, that same point applies just as much for tires. I mean, in fact, we can be more confident at the moment that there tends to be, and I use the words deliberately loosely, we can see that cheaper tires are generally more, quote, more toxic. They definitely have, there's quite a strong relationship between the price of the tire and the chemical composition. So it's very reasonable to think that the same thing will apply to brakes. That's where the strength of this program of having the 10 different monitoring stations and linking that to the fleet information may well help us to bring out those sort of interdependencies.
Right, but then you're not going to be able to get a California brake and a California tire. You're going to get an East LA tire and a Ruby Doo tire.
Well, and that's although our starting point is to have one Californian tire, if we find the level of heterogeneity at that level, we may well have to adapt, as you say. I think ultimately it's got to, how can we work with what we're doing to come out with the lowest uncertainty estimates? And we're certainly flexible enough within that to respond if that's what the data is telling us.
Okay, the final question is what's the resolution on your TOF MS?
Oh, I'm not the organic chemist. I mean, I do know that it can resolution down to the parts per trillion level in certain cases.
No, the mass resolution. So in terms of compound identification, I mean, typically a high-res mass spec is anywhere from 25,000 to 100,000. And it makes life a lot simpler in terms of specific compound identification, the higher resolution you have. And so I'm just wondering whether you've got enough resolution that you're going to be able to do a reasonable amount of non-targeted analysis and identifying likely chemical compounds.
I'll have to take that away and respond specifically on that question. I mean, what we have been able to show through the work with NPL is the a very good level of repeatability at very low concentrations and a good ability to identify and quantify compounds down to very low concentrations. But I will take it away to my chemist and respond to you specifically on that point in quantitative terms.
Great, thank you.
All right, thanks. We're going to go to the next hand I see raised, Ryan Sinclair.
Oh, hey, great presentation. Just wondering, I mean, lots of things I'm thinking about with this, but one thing is, I know this is probably not in your scope of work and in the proposal so much, but you mentioned having a fingerprint tool that you can use to identify the different compounds in tires and how all the great interpretations you can have from that. But hey, what about tire fires? I know that those aren't in this scope of work really, but will your fingerprint analysis be able to separate out tire wear particles from those other compounds that are maybe slightly different or much different? I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the literature, but that happen in tire fires. Tire fires happen in some of the more remote, rural, agricultural areas, somewhat unintentionally, but sometimes intentionally. Just wondering about that.
It's a question I had never thought of before. I mean, in a sense, that is an ultimate pyrolysis experiment. And so it may well be that what we're seeing from our pyrolysis method may actually be extremely effective in identifying those compounds from fire events. As to whether that enables us to distinguish between tire particles directly from the vehicles versus from burning, disposed of tires, without looking, we couldn't I couldn't tell you. That's not an experiment we've run yet. Although it's one, I will take that idea away. I hadn't thought of that.
Thanks.
But if it's a prevalent thing in the South Bay, then we probably should potentially discuss it further. It's not factored into our proposal. I don't think it's technically in scope, but if it could be a material contributor to the air quality effects, we may be able to do something interesting with the data as part of this program.
I just know that it happens occasionally in the Eastern Coachella Valley, and people usually talk about it when it happens. So that was what I was thinking about.
There was one in the UK we had which burnt for 15 years solidly. So these things can actually be significant contributors to local air quality. So I take your point very well, and I will factor that into my thinking. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Next hand I see raised, Xiaolang Wang.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. So I saw you're going to analyze 600 PM10 samples. On the other hand, you're going to do emission modeling, but I see a missing link for the receptor-based source apportionment to link the filters from the emissions. Are you going to do a source apportionment component in your study?
Anne-Marie, is that something you can chip in on?
Hello, thank you for your question. My name is Anne-Marie Carlton. I'm from the University of California, Irvine. We have not planned to do receptor modeling. We plan to do high resolution modeling using a hybrid approach of CMAC and AirMod R-line contributions, but we haven't planned to do receptor modeling.
So in one of your objectives is to do attribution of these the contribution of the brake and the tire to the samples that you collected. How are you going to link these two?
I thought that we would do that in a factor analysis way. I guess you could call it receptor modeling. I'm just not thinking of it in that way. I'm thinking that there will be certain chemical fingerprints associated with different sources, and then we'll be able to look for those fingerprints in samples.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's see here. Next hand I see is Michael Jarrett.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting study. I'm wondering, so you're going to take the 600 samples, and I'm joined a little bit late, so apologize if I missed this, but how are you going to locate those? Like what are your criteria for selecting sites that are likely to have enhancements in brake and tire wear or background sites? And then what are the logistics involved? Because that's a huge number of samples. So I just want to get some more information on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's one. Beg your pardon, carry on.
Yeah, I just, that can have a very dramatic impact on the type of data you're going to have to work with. So
yeah, sure.
Maybe get some more detail.
Yeah, this is one of the key things where we're working hand in hand with AQMD. So we're actually using the existing 10 sampling sites dotted around the geographical area. And the filter papers that are already being collected, we will take a portion of those. So essentially the sampling footprint pre-exists, and we're working with the grain of that. So fortunately, we do not need to establish a new monitoring network, but the benefit is, well, it fits exactly with the work being done to date.
Yeah, I guess, a concern there is that, a lot of those sites are very removed from traffic. They're not really representative of the population type exposures. So it seems like if you don't have any additional sites, it's quite likely you're going to get a very biased sample of brake and tire wear particles. And I just wonder, I think there has to be more measurements at 10 locations in a region that's, tens of thousands of square kilometers with very complex terrain, topography, and emission profiles. So
I think.
Is there any other plan for doing other types of sampling, or is that it?
I think Scott wants to chip in on this one?
Sure, yeah. Hey, Mike, it's Scott Epstein. So I may want to hand this over to our modeling analysis division as well, but the 10 sites are pretty well distributed throughout the region. 2 of them are on freeways, New Road 60 and California 710. One is in the Coachella Valley, and then the remainder are in South Coast Air Basin. All the sites are in environmental justice areas, so there is a fair bit of contribution from local emissions. But I think, I mean, ideally we'd have many more sites, you know, but it just kind of comes down to resource limitations.
But it seems like you need to get some sites set up so there'd be some sort of gradient away from the major roads. I mean, if you just take one site that's close to a freeway, you're only gonna have 2 heavy traffic impacted sites. And it seems like this part of the study needs to maybe be expanded, or, you know, to capture some different gradients and and, you know, if you're going to model it going into the future, you can't just have these high impact sites and then a bunch of background sites. You need to have something that's going to capture a broader array of the types of gradients and emission profiles that are likely to occur. They're going to be very, very dependent on also things like topography, you know, and intersection density and things like that, where you're going to have much more braking action. So
yeah, definitely. Point well taken. Yeah, I think, you know, we tend to think for exhaust emissions that you have the highest exhaust emissions along the busiest roads, right? But for brake and tire wear, I'm sure you've thought of this as well. Brake and tire wear, that may not necessarily be the case. I mean, maybe you have more brake and tire wear emissions along like major arterials with stoplights, you know, than you would along kind of more of a free flowing freeway. And there is a pretty wide distribution of our kind of local neighborhood, regional, non-near road sites, a distribution of kind of how close they are to those sort of major arterials as well. But yeah, ideally we'd have more sites, but
I mean, you've got more sites in your monitoring network, right? Could you expand to more of those?
Hi, Dr. Jared. This is Jason Lowe, Deputy Executive
Hi,
Officer.
Jason.
How's it going? Good to see you again. So,
Yeah, nice seeing you too.
right. Yeah, so we do have about 35 air monitoring stations located throughout the basin, and a lot of the chosen ones for mates are specifically for representation, as Scott has mentioned. And we do have this kind of good mix of kind of population centers, and they are designed for area-wide representation. And, you know, as mentioned, the near road kind of is cited for specifically the near road representation of the pollutants there. So I guess part of it is when looking at the design of this and maybe in terms of the modeling design, I mean, in the past, this has served as well as a representation of the mixture necessary to do the model inputs. But if there, and we're open to this before in terms of for like maybe this purpose, if there are certain areas that would benefit, and that's something that we can definitely work with Nick on, is to say, are there ones that would create a better representation for this specific science question? And from what we've heard so far, the 10 that we have existing are ones that were adequate enough to do the analysis that's being done. But if there's other input that we need to consider, then that's what the purpose, I think, of this group is. But recognize as there are some resource limitations just on our side, just for the amount of, we're handling all the PM analysis, the VOC analysis, and the extra other real-time information that's coming in through the MATES project. So
I would encourage you to maybe look at doing fewer temporal samples and more spatial samples that are going to get you a broader representation across the region. I mean, it's that would, I think, strengthen the study. And just as an aside, is one of the near road sites the one that's down in Orange County? We use that for some other. It's close to Disneyland. That's a very non-representative site because they blow fireworks every day.
Right. I think
so. We ended up having to throw those data out. So there are going to be those little vagaries too that you don't want to have come into your 10 sites if it's only 10 sites. So
right.
So that would be my recommendation. That and that I think if you're going to choose some other sites, you want to do a more thorough characterization of the types of land. Try to convince people that these are representative what's the land use, what's the traffic flow, what's the braking action likely to be there due to topography and intersections and on-ramps. And then, you know, do some sort of comparison to the rest of the region. Because I think this is going to be a fundamental issue that's going to come up over and over again, is the representativeness of having such a small number of spatial samples.
Right, and that's great input. And just so you know, and when the design of the neural network, a lot of that was actually taking into consideration traffic, brake usage, congestion. So those were factors that went into deciding the 4 locations that we have. And it was to try to take a combination of those factors, kind of see what the most impacted areas in our region were. So that's something that was looked at and something that we continue to look at.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, good questions. And I think one thing we're going to hear, unfortunately, throughout all of this is we're going to answer some questions which are going to raise more questions, because there's just the science is so open here. So I think that's you're pointing out some really good points there, but I think we're going to hear that as a theme throughout this entire study. There's some limits. You want to go ahead, Anne-Marie?
Thank you for letting me interject. I wanted to make the point, something that I forgot to mention before is that part of our interpolation to get the high resolution surfaces is a creaking of the measurements. And so when we do the cross validation, we can take out some factors or test some of the factors that are being brought up specifically and see which weighted variables help us in the cross validation the most, and take that into consideration. And just think that the modeling part might help address some of these questions.
But what's going to be your data support for the kriging, though? I mean, you can't krig with 10 sites.
I'm going to use a variety of different variables, including meteorology and topography, like the you mentioned earlier. And I also plan to use other sampling locations in addition to the model outputs.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to, you know, if you want to do kriging, I mean, it's inferential statistics and it won't work with 10 sites. So you need more data support for that. I mean, basically what will happen is the model will break down. So you're going to get something that's a very, very similar to an inverse distance weighting, because you won't be able to optimize the kriging spatial weights between sites because there won't be enough data. So it's just going to be like an inverse distance weighting unless you get more sites, more data support.
Okay, thanks for that. We're definitely going to take this back. We appreciate it. I mean, part of the reason for this tag is to get these kinds of comments. So we're going to have to take this back and chew on it, but appreciate it. Thanks. I'm going to go to the next hand I see, Michael Kleiman.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'd like to go back to the 600 mate samples, and I'm wondering, and maybe you mentioned it, but will those samples be subjected to the 2D analysis that's done with the pyrolysis samples? Because I think that would be a great way to nail down potential tracer compounds, to be able to find a commonality. So, Nick, is that something you'll be doing?
Yeah, that's exactly the plan. So we're all 600 we will be submitting to the same 2D GC approach. So we will get a very rich set of data from all of those.
Great. And how will this data be made available? Are there going to be more or less annual reports on it, or what do you foresee in terms of program output that we can use?
Well, from my point of view, and Scott may well want to chip in, but I mean, all the data will be provided to AQMD. We will be doing, apart from the main report, looking to submit to scientific journals for peer-reviewed publication. I mean, we also are used to doing a lot of outreach activity, and we even, as a company, we run 2 conferences on tire emissions specifically. We held one in May this year in Southern California. So we have lots of different channels subject to AQMD sort of agreement. We think, you know, the comms, the outbound interaction of this is something that is important and something that we can contribute to a lot. But obviously it sits within the wider MATES program. So maybe Scott, you want to add a bit more to that?
Yeah, Nick, it sounds like you pretty much covered it. The other thing I can add is that we'll probably at some point when there are results come back to the tag to show those results, and there'll be a draft report that people can comment on before we get to the final report.
That's great. The other thing I was wondering, this is from my selfish point of view as a toxicologist, whether some of these samples could be made available for toxicity testing, especially for compounds that OHIA has not yet done, you know, an REL or an evaluation.
Well, that's a very helpful suggestion, because one of the things we flagged in the presentation where there will be a lot of compounds which don't have OER information. And so how moving forward do we plug those gaps? So in principle, I mean, I would be very interested if we can help support that. I don't know what the practicalities would be, but that sounds like a very good idea.
Mike,
Thank
just
you.
to clarify. So Mike, you're saying the actual filters be available or the information that we get from the analysis of the filters?
Well, having actual filters would be great, but even with the information for some of it, we'd be able to select some key compounds that, you know, especially if they're going to be present at relatively consistent concentrations across the tires and brakes, that we could use as, you know, tracer items and then look at their toxicology. I think that would be a really neat way to blend the different areas of science with this.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually one of our goals, is to be able to identify dominant compounds that don't have established risk factors for future study. And we're not the agency that does that sort of analysis, but yeah, we'd be happy to share all that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I see another hand raised, James Shower.
Yeah, thanks. I apologize, I don't have my camera in this remote office I'm in, but thank you for the presentation. I think there's lots of really interesting things. I'm very excited to see the results of the fingerprinting and how all that comes together. There's a lot of novel, good data there. The 2 questions I had, one is that I guess I wanted just to push a little bit on the idea of what you're using or planning to use for emission factors. So again, my model of having done some of this work 20 years ago is that, you know, we think about, you mentioned about the re-emission of resuspended soil, and if that makes up 50% of the emissions, what are we using for emission factors for that? I realize where the fingerprinting is coming from, but also in the case of, like, for example, brake wear, my experience is that the, you know, what wears sort of builds up in the housing of the brakes and things, and eventually that slowly comes out. So it's not like, you know, it's not like there's just a fixed emission rate that you can get from a brake dyno, and then this idea of how you're estimating emission factors related to, you know, with trucks. We found that trucks produce a lot of resuspended road dust, which then has a lot of tire and brake wear in there. So just trying to understand more about how the emission factors are coming. The second thing I just wanted to bring up is we seem to be using the word compounds a lot. I just want to make sure we're being clear about that. In the brake wear, my guess is you're actually measuring elements. You're not measuring compounds. And in the pyrolysis, you're looking at breakdown products. So I guess I'm a little bit puzzled a little bit about how we're actually going to get from those fingerprinting, which would be elemental, I assume is elemental for the brakes, and the pyrolysis compounds, going back to thinking about compounds. So for example, a major component of brake wear is barium sulfate. But you're not, I don't think you're really, unless I'm misunderstood, I don't think you're measuring barium sulfate, you're measuring barium and sulfate. And so trying to reconstruct what the true compounds are in the context of toxicity is quite different than just the elemental components. So I think those are two things, I don't think there's easy answers to that, but just something I think should be thought about going forward.
Yeah, taking your questions in reverse, the second one first. I mean, you're quite right. On the brake side, we're talking about the metallic elements. Whereas on the organic side, it'll be the compounds. I mean, the key thing is that we're applying to the brake pad and the filter papers the same method, and then that's what allows the direct comparison. On the first question, which is the answer to that is a complex one. I mean, I suppose again the knowledge is quite fragmentary at the moment. We've been actually doing separately some CFD modeling on both brakes and tires to understand more about how the particles get sprayed from their source and how far they dissipate, and whether to what degree the brake particles do get stuck in the housing, and do they then get deposited in lumps, or is it do they actually get sprayed out much more dynamically? We actually think so. We don't have a definitive answer to this, but it does appear to be that it is more. There isn't a huge amount of accumulation on vehicle. And so when it comes thinking about emissions factors, we think it's probably going to be a reasonable approximation that you can link what we're observing to the vehicle activity data and get a reasonable estimate. But to be perfectly candid, that is still partial knowledge and an evolving area. But I mean, your comment is very well taken.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on the first point, again, I fully appreciate when you're trying to do the source receptor relationship, you are using the same methods on the filter and the emissions. But when you're talking about compounds that are being used for toxicology estimates, those are not the same things. And then just real quick about the emission factors, I think the understanding about what the activity does to the resuspended road dust, my gut feeling is that the resuspended road dust is an important part of these brake and tire wear emissions. So if that's 50%, making sure that's captured well. Again, I don't know that we have an answer now, but it's something I think some sensitivity analysis needs to be thought about, or looking at sort of using an inverse model approach to sort of just make sure that there's closure on that, because those could be wildly different. Thank you.
Noted on that second point. And on the first point about the toxicity, absolutely understood in terms of the actual compounds themselves. What we have developed, and this is continuing work, is to work out where we're seeing derivative products, reaction products in our samples. To effectively, we're building an understanding of the chemical chain that leads to that. 6-PPD quinone is the obvious example as a derivative from the 6-PPD in tires. So we're building this knowledge base to be able to work backwards from what we observe in these samples to what that means was in the original tire. And so we know both things. Again, that remains work in progress and definitely needs to be borne in mind if we do some toxicology work. So thank you very much.
Okay, very good questions. I really do appreciate that and feedback. We do have some questions from the audience as well. I'm actually going to start here in the room. So Lakshmi, if you want to come up to a mic so we can hear, I think there's a mic right over here if you want. And just click the button once and then go ahead and ask your question or comment.
Thanks, Nick. It was a very nice presentation.
Introduce yourself and your
I'm Lakshmi Jairam from Ramball. So thank you, Nick. Very good presentation. I'm really excited to see, more research in the tire and brake wear. It's sort of a, ignored area of research, especially when it comes to transportation. So I have actually about 3 comments here. I'm guessing you're aware of all the research that CARB is doing, the emissions testing related to tire wear. I know Scott was at that conference, CRCM sat earlier this year, and I was wondering if there was some coordination with the folks at CARB who are doing this research as part of your study.
So yeah, I'm absolutely aware of that work and prior work they've done as well, the previous roadside analysis from a couple of years ago. And we're in regular contact with the researchers there. I mean, there's no formal link between this project and that, but there's certainly, yeah, this is a relatively small world of researchers, and there's lots of informal links and knowledge sharing. And that will continue. I mean, I attended both the MSAT and CRC and will continue to do so. Subject to AQMD's view, if there's any possibilities of more formal links, I'm not averse to that at all. After all, there's lots of knowledge gaps, and the more that we can collaborate together, great. But I guess in a sense, that's not quite for me to call. You know, as you can see, I mean, not only am I a participant at MSAT, but as I mentioned, we run conferences specifically dedicated to tire emissions, which will be run again in Southern California in May next year, which, everyone in the room is invited to. And that demonstrates, you know, how important knowledge sharing and interaction between researchers is in this area, because it is fast evolving.
And I can just say from the staff level, so we work closely with CARB to help develop the RFP and actually even select the winning proposal to make sure, you know, we want to make sure that we complement the work that CARB is doing and not repeat anything that they're doing.
Okay, because I know they've already tested a series of brakes, and you have testing in this. I just wanted to make sure that overlap was happening.
Yeah, kind of the main difference is they do a lot more bottom-up work, whereas this project is a bit more top-down. So we think they're pretty complementary.
Okay, so my next comment is somewhat related to what James was saying. I know you're doing the ambient sampling, and you'll probably do some sort of a fingerprinting to figure out, you know, the ambient PM, what fraction of it is tire wear, brake wear. But like you mentioned in your presentation, some of it is primary tire wear and brake wear, like when the vehicle is driving, is just coming off of the vehicle. And some of it is probably a portion of the entrained road dust that's on the road. When you're doing the modeling, I'm assuming you're probably using like an MFAC model or CARB's AP42 equation for the entrained road dust and the CARB model for tire wear, brake wear for your sources. I don't think I've seen data out there about like what fraction of the entrained road dust is tire wear, brake wear. I'm not sure, like, if I just missed it and there's already some research out there. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, because that has to be sort of intrinsic to the modeling and trying to make it work, right?
So in terms of what's known, the data is very limited at the moment, and what data there is has a massive spread of the results. So I wouldn't say there's any consensus as to what proportion of entrained road dust is made up of tires. My hypothesis that I don't have full proof of yet is the reason they get a big spread in answers is because the reality of it on the ground is that the proportion of tires in the road dust varies hugely with exactly, you know, is it near a junction or is it a high speed? So, but we don't have a definitive answer to that yet. I should say from within the scope of this project, though, we are only being asked to look at the sum of primary and then resuspended tires. We are not required to be able to differentiate those two. That would be another whole project, which delighted to work on, but is technically out of this scope. So I guess it's one of the simplifying simplifying conditions of this, that we are not having to distinguish between those two.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in this first stage before you get to the next. But I'm just curious, I don't think we have an answer to this yet, but if you don't know that split, how are you actually going to do the MATES modeling, the MATES 6 modeling? Maybe that comes at a later stage, but I'm just curious.
I think Anne-Marie might.
Yeah, I think, you know, Jamie Shower got to this point before. I think it's going to require various sensitivities and testing different fractional contributions.
Okay. To
the total observed.
Wait to see how it goes and learn more about that.
Me too.
My other question was on one of your slides. I think it was like your earlier slides where you talked about those 600 filter samples. I also saw that there were some acetate filters for Chrome 6 sampling. Can you tell me like how Chrome 6 kind of comes into this study? Is it like part of tire wear or brake wear? Like where do you see it and how are you connecting it?
I don't know if Jim Smith, Jim, are you still there? Because he would be the best person to comment on this. Yes, I think he is.
Yeah, I'm here.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah. So the Chromium 6 component came up in a recent discussion that we had with AQMD. Since that was another objective, I understand, of the Mate 6 project, they were asking if we could do an analysis of Chromium 6 on our breakware samples specifically. We had some discussion with AQMD staff, and we came up with a plan whereby we will be providing filter samples of our breakware particles to AQMD staff, since they already have an SOP for analyzing Chromium 6 in filter samples. And so during some of the runs that we do of our actual brake dynamometer, we'll supply some samples, and then they will run an analysis of Chromium 6 from those representative samples. And so I think that's sort of the compromise that we came up with, since it was a little bit outside the scope, of our particular project, but it was something that we could definitely, collaborate with AQMD on.
Okay. That was helpful. I have a last comment.
Real quick, Voxmay, I saw Phil, you had your hand up. Did you want to comment on this same point?
No, I was going to comment on the Chrome 6, but it turns out it's not really relevant. So
okay, thanks.
I put my hand down.
So you said you've already looked at sort of the tire wear and this huge variation in sort of the chemical fingerprint and concentrations of the toxics in different tires. I'm guessing the brake wear, you probably get like a wide range like that. And you're going to do some sort of averaging. I was wondering if you're also looking at, the types of tires on the road, like of the vehicles that are in California, using like some fleet data or DMV data to figure out like which tires are used more. Are you doing like a weighted average or like a straight average?
No, the objective is to do it effectively weighted by prevalence on the road, essentially. Okay. In our database, we've already got a good spread of makes and models, and also light, medium, heavy duty tires. To put that together with the best data we can get on what's installed on the fleet, then that gives us the best weighted average. That's certainly the objective.
Okay, thank you very much.
Dr. Jarrett, see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just wondered if just maybe this harkens back to Mike Kleinman's earlier comment that are you going to do any oxidative stress assays on the filters? Because that's some of the things that we found in our research, that because it's enhanced with metals, the oxidative potential of the brake and tire wear particles is higher, and that's probably like one of the key overarching hypotheses about why air pollution is affecting health, because it generates oxidative stress in the lung that spills over into other organ systems.
Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, it's not within the scope of this particular project, but to the extent that we can contribute into further work, absolutely.
Yeah, it might be something, they're not really expensive assays. So if you're collecting all those filters, you might want to try to characterize whether there are differences at sites where you've got enhanced brake and tire wear particles.
Yeah, great. Well, we'll pick that up with AQMD afterwards. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I do see that there are some hands raised and some questions in the Q&A. I'm also a little mindful of time. This is a great discussion. I definitely want to continue like the discussion, but I'm gonna, I also see one more in the room. I'll get right back to you. But I think what I want to do after you is we'll go to the hands that are raised for Zoom. There's a number of questions that I think some of these are also coming from the people who are going to be asking questions. I might actually skip some of the written questions here. We can get back to them individually, but I want to make sure to get through the rest of our agenda here today. But I saw you had yours up.
Thank you very much. And just a quick question, actually an extension of what you were asking. Does the age of the tire and the depth of the tread change the chemical composition, especially considering the fact that sometimes then metal becomes part of the factor as the tire ages and some of the metal of the structure actually becomes part of the what's excreted?
It's unlikely that the metal in the structure of the tire makes any material outward contribution, but the chemical composition of the rubber does change in different parts of the tire. However, our sampling in our database is from the tread itself. It is true that that is subject to some degree of aging, and the lighter compounds will tend to diminish in concentration in the tread over time. Although a lot of that off-gassing happens in the relatively early life of the tire. We're currently, I mean, outside of this project, we are doing off-gassing experiments to try and quantify those effects. So there may be something that we can bring additionally to this project to help understand that. Yes, but the things which tend to be characteristic of the organic chemical fingerprint of these tires tends to be the heavier VOCs, and those tend to off-gas more slowly. So in practical terms, given we've got our data backbone in the databases from the tread specifically, which is what is getting shed, and it covers the heavier organics, we don't think, while that is going on, I don't think it has it doesn't undermine the effectiveness of the fingerprinting.
Okay, I'm going to go now to hands raised, pardon me, on Zoom. I see Dr. Eng, looks like you have your hand raised, and I do note you have a lot of questions that you put in the Q&A. Really do appreciate that, but maybe we can get to the questions that you'd like to ask here, and if we need to follow up on some of these written ones, we can definitely do that with you.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
for it.
Yes, I think I'll summarize the most important things. I have written other public comments from other work groups, so maybe Dr. Nick Molden can take a look at them as part of the beginning of his research. But my most big concern that I didn't know before is I think your team needs to have, you have a special professor for brake wear. I think you need a special professor for tire and road wear on your team, because you did not identify that in your team. I think the second most important thing is that on the proposal in Objective 1 and Objective 2, they're very generic. And I think what I propose is that for Objective 1, you modify it for this study, 6 ppd, 6 ppd-OH, 6 ppd-Q, and PAHs shall be considered as compounds with LEHHA inhalation and risk factors, and have them included on your project. And on Objective 2, they should also modify it to say that you will specifically look at 6 ppd, 6 ppd-Q, and PAHs, because those need to be done since there's so little information and it continues to develop. And my other also stuff that I've given to the AQMD, it turns out PAHs are also used as part of tire manufacturing. So I think PAHs need to be specifically also called out in terms of what you look for in your study. And I guess lastly, what I'd really I'd like to ask about how you, when you do your sampling, if it's all air sampling, it's light, very light stuff. A lot of stuff just sits on the road and continues to outgas and leach stuff. So are you going to sweep up particles and do sort of the light versus heavy as part of your research? That may be needed to get a good look at the whole thing. And then finally, there's an ambiguity between tire wear, road wear, and road dust. And I wanted to say that a lot of asphalt roads nowadays are made from recycled tires, and it is already known that the 6 ppd residue in the crumb rubber actually helps the asphalt to stay more flexible and not crack compared to stuff that doesn't have that in it. So your roads themselves, your road wear, are essentially becoming equivalent to tire wear, so it's a new stationary source. So those are my main points. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those. I don't think I can answer all of those in full with complete justice right now, but I'll try and give a quick response to each. On that very last point, I mean, that one is a very substantive and very interesting topic, but I think that's not one I can practically address right now, but happy to do that offline. As a general comment as well, you talk about a number of things which are absolutely, very relevant to the topic of the impact of tires on the environment, but quite a lot of those lie outside of the scope of this specific project. So again, I'm very happy to discuss that. We've devoted at least 5 years dedicated to this and know a lot about 6 ppd in tires, the PAH as you talk about, the near full chemical profiling. So I'm very happy to have offline discussion. I think for the purposes of this meeting, we need to keep within the scope of this particular project. So going to your first point about UCI are in the role of sort of experts on the brake side. On the tire side, well, I mean, essentially that is us. That is emissions analytics. In the work we've done and dedicated over the last few years to understanding this, but we also haven't done that on our own. I mean, we have very close and ongoing research work with not only Imperial College in London, where I'm an honorary research fellow, but also with University of Cambridge and a number of other universities, including Queen Mary University in London on the toxicology side. So I think the combination of emissions analytics and our collaborators mean we are very, we have a high level of competence on the tire side. Just trying to recall your other questions.
I guess you really have you just told me that 6 ppd and 6 ppdq and on PAHs are not going to be included as part of your extensive chemical list study? Is it out of scope? That was my question. I think it needs to be in scope.
Well, so we are using the chemical composition analysis to work out from a filter paper sample of airborne material, what proportion of that is tire material or brake material. That in a sentence is the objective of this. In terms of other chemicals and their direct effects, via human inhalation. I mean, I don't know, Scott, if you want to chip in, but in terms of the scope, I mean, we have to stick to the primary scope here, which is understanding what proportion tire and brakes makes up on these airborne filter samples.
We'll see 6 ppd in the measurements, right?
It's sometimes you do, but you may also say 6 ppd quinone because of the reaction. So there is that in the atmosphere. There will be that reaction going on, but we do know we can see the levels of 6 ppd in all the original tires to a high degree of accuracy. So we have that body of knowledge. Yes. But I'm just, in terms of where our relative activity within this will go, it is primarily around understanding that that proportion of tires, tire material on the filter paper.
And just to add on to there, we also are looking at PAH as overall as part of MATES. So there's the whole other component of MATES that's well beyond what this study is too. So Dr. Eng, I will note we did get your written questions. We also have, I really appreciate that you put in the written questions in here. I think there's probably a good offline discussion that we can have. So
Sure, absolutely. But I still would like to see it formally written in the proposal that when you say these compounds will be studied, that you also specifically include these particular compounds to add, even if they don't have OEHHA values. That's basically my point. Thank you.
Okay. I appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and move on. Again, I'm looking at the clock and I want to keep going here. So thank you, Dr. Eng. I see Harvey Etter, your hand is up. You there, Harvey?
Hello, am I being heard?
Yep, go for it.
Good morning. My name's Harvey Etter. I'm the founder director of Public Solar Power Coalition, been around 40, 50 years. We brought a lot of this stuff about hybrids and electric vehicles 20, 30 years back. Anyway, what's going to happen with electric vehicles and with hybrids, with tire wear and brake, and what happens with regenerative braking? So those are two things. Another thing is asbestos and PFAS. Asbestos, I worked on the pipeline in Alaska. I was exposed to asbestos. My understanding through the union and find out that there's 40,000 asbestos deaths a year. So we only say there's 7,500 emissions deaths from everything in the state of California per year. And I don't think that's reflected in there. So anyway, if that can be addressed, I'm all ears.
I think I can probably comment on at least the first one, less so on the second one, on the effect of electric vehicles and hybrids. Well, actually, I wouldn't put those two together because the effects are quite different. So
right.
Electric vehicles with their additional average weight of around 800 pounds, we estimate will lead to about a 25% increase in tire wear emissions. However,
800, 8,000.
No, 800 pounds.
The battery's got to weigh as much as that. Anyway, excuse me.
Yeah, they would say on a 75 kilowatt hour electric vehicle, the battery would be about 800 pounds in weight. So that's the net additional weight to the vehicle. That would lead to approximately a 25% increase in tire emissions. However, that would be offset because of the regenerative braking. That would likely reduce and significantly reduce the brake wear emissions. So the total effect on non-exhaust emissions may be more neutral. However, what you've got is a changing mix of the pollutants. So you've got more of the organics in tires and less of the metals in brakes. So the net effect will be interesting to see how it plays out. But that's the mix change I would expect. Hybrids, I would say, is quite different. If we're talking about non-plug-in hybrids like Toyota Prius, actually they're hardly heavier than a standard vehicle. So I would not expect any significant increase in tire emissions, but they do have the regenerative braking. So there should still be decent reduction in brake wear. So actually hybrids are likely to reduce the total amount of non-exhaust emissions. So in a sense, if we're looking through the lens of non-exhaust emissions, hybrids would be better for air quality than full electric vehicles. Although there's a lot of variability there as well. And if you drive in a full electric vehicle in a very eco-friendly way, you can actually significantly reduce your tire emissions as well. As to then whether you use the ludicrous mode or not is entirely down to consumer preference.
And then also the tailpipe emissions come into this too, of course.
Yeah, particularly CO2. CO2 side, I mean, the emissions controls on hybrids now work well, although there are still remnant hydrocarbon emissions coming out of the tailpipe too.
NOx as well for our region is a particular concern. Okay.
And asbestos. Ho.
Go ahead.
I did not hear asbestos addressed. Asbestos and PFAS. They said it's going to take $16 trillion a year for 10 years to get rid of PFAS. I think just in the United States. What's up with asbestos? 40,000 deaths a year, according to EPA and Department of Labor.
So it's asbestos or PFAS and anything that you've identified in brakes or tires?
So it doesn't show up in organic analysis of tires, asbestos. As to PFAS, I would say it comes back to the notion of uncertainties. There are certain people who've suggested that PFASs are present in tires, but I would say that exists within a realm of some uncertainty at the moment. So I would not like to say anything definitive on that. It's a very good question and an absolutely valid research question for all the reasons your question suggests. But I don't think there's a settled view on the prevalence of PFASs in tires yet.
Asbestos? Been around forever.
That's not something that we see through our method. So on that, unfortunately, I have nothing to offer.
There could be a literature search on that as well, etc., as you're doing in other areas.
Yeah, we can bear that in mind during the literature search phase. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We have one last hand raised. Moses Huerta.
Thank you, Ian. This is Moses Huerta, a member of the PACE Initiative, a research project funded through the Air Resources Board. I just wanted a quick comment to support Professor Jarrett's comment as far as getting a little more detail in some of the more active locations. I appreciate his comment in reference to the on-off ramp where you get a lot more activity as far as braking and tire activity, and also would like to ask if to take into consideration from the AQMD the investment that's being done in communities in these areas with the hardware, as you know, if we can utilize that data, I think would be behooves us to get a more broad perspective. As you know, some of these communities, in particular, my experience, I do have failure reference monitors that have that capability. Currently studying X-Chrome, but if it would be possible to take into consideration to expand that data load, as Professor Jarrett mentioned, I think would be beneficial to all of us to get a broader picture. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks, Moses. Actually, one of the things I think you're teeing up is, how does data become available to the public, which really, I think, ties in very well to our next agenda item. So I think that was a good time to transition to that one, because we did want to talk about, we talked a lot here. Thank you very much, Nick. Very good presentation, very good discussion. It did come up as part of this, how does this information become available for community, and what can be done with it. So I think that's really what we want to talk about next, is how to present the data. And so we have two presenters. First is Nico Schulte will be presenting, and followed by Chris Lim, and talking through what we've done before and then what we're planning to potentially do moving forward. So with that, go for it.
All right. So for the previous campaign in MATES, we developed these, or AQMD developed these data visualization tools to provide information to the public on the results. And so I'm going to cover our plans for updating those for MATES 6. So this is the outline of the what I'm talking about today. So I'll present some goals for developing these data visualizations. I'm going to go over a data visualization tool for health risk assessment. For health risk data for MATES 5 and our plans for updating that in MATES 6. Sounds good. Okay. I'm going to provide, the plans for updating that in MAID 6. Chris Lim is going to go over data visualization tools for air monitoring data developed for MAIDS 5 and also plans to update that. And then we're going to have time for some questions for the tag and any feedback. So these are the primary goals that we have when developing these tools. So these are designed for general public audience. They present the major elements of MAITS. So this includes, the purpose of MAITS, the methods, major findings, conclusions. And these tools should answer common questions about air toxics and also criteria air pollution. So the major questions that these are primarily designed to answer is, what is the air toxic health risk at one location? So these tools often include maps to show that health risk. We also have ways to compare that risk with other locations. We also have data on other pollutants, so criteria pollutants, and how those levels compare at different locations. And then we also show data on trends, so air toxics trends and criteria pollutant trends. And one goal is to make this more sort of accessible for the general public. So this provides high-level summaries and also more data that can be obtained by interacting with the data visualization pages. We also provide data export and data downloads as well. Oops. All right, so I'm going to provide a live demo of the MAITS 5 tool. So let me just switch to that. Okay, so this is what a user sees when they open up the MAITS 5 data visualization tool. At first, there's information showing how to use the tool. And so this kind of provides like a brief tutorial that users can use in order to learn about the tool. We have a landing page, which provides sort of overarching, like broad conclusions from MAITS 5 in this page, and is sort of interactive for users to sort of interact with that data here. And then the tool is broken down with these tabs at the top of the screen. So there's data on cancer risk in this tool. So this provides modeled cancer risk data as well as measured cancer risk data. And users can use this to compare different, in this case, zip codes and monitoring stations. And it shows the cancer risk information there and also information about pollutants contributing to risk. For the first time, we presented data on non-cancer health risks. And so this is shown in terms of the hazard index at the monitoring stations. And there's information about the target organ systems for these hazard indices. We also provide information on sort of supplemental data that can impact air toxics and health risks. And so we provide information about the SB 535 areas, CalEnviro Screen 3, the Healthy Places Index, and also information on green space or open space. Users can look at the air toxics trends, which shows trends since MAITS 2. And so this shows the monitoring data-based cancer risk trends, and users can use the map to identify where those measurements were made and also select data to filter the data that's shown on these trends. There's information about gridded model data on cancer risk. So this allows users to select MAITS 4 and MAITS 5 data, and also multi-pathway or inhalation-only risks. And finally, there's information about criteria pollutants. So this shows the criteria pollutant data since 1999 at the various monitoring stations. And additionally, there's information about the criteria pollutant trends as well. So once this loads, yeah. So you can see the trends since 1999 for the, all of the criteria pollutants, and the users can select those at the top here. And users can see where those measurements are made and filter the data as well. So let me switch back to the slides. Okay, so that's the data visualization tool for health risk data for MATES 5. So I'm going to cover some preliminary plans for updates for MATES 6. And so this shows kind of a mock-up of an overview of how that data will be organized. And so we plan to sort of simplify this somewhat to reduce those nested tabs that are in the MATES 5 tool, which can be kind of complex for a general public audience to use. And so the general layout will likely include a home page, a landing page, air toxics page, criteria air pollution page, other environmental indicators. So this is like the Cal virus screen data, and data download and export. And so this will show, high level information first, and then users can scroll in the page to view more detailed information. We plan to simplify the presentation relative to MATES 5. So we hope to enhance this for mobile devices, since most people are using this on their phones. And we're planning to use more of like map layers and enhanced GUI features to visualize the data instead of those nested tabs that we had in the MATES 5 data visualization. This is a mock-up of the homepage. So this is basically providing background information, purpose of MATES, and then directs users to see, the subpages on air toxics and criteria air pollution, or other environmental indicators. For air toxics, we plan to summarize the major elements of MATES 6. So the history and purpose of the program, the methods, major findings and conclusions. We are planning to include the maps showing the risk data and also trends in this update. For criteria air pollution, again, we're planning to update the data. We're, again, still going to show the maps of the design values for PM2.5, PM10, ozone, NO2, carbon monoxide, and SO2. And we'll update the data through the current year when we develop this. And it's possible that we may update this, on an annual basis going forward after that. For other environmental indicators, we are planning to include the same indicators as for MATES 5 again, but we are seeking feedback on any data to include here or to remove. And then some other improvements we're planning is first, reduce loading time. So there is, some delay when you're opening up these various tabs from the MATES 5 data visualization. And so we're hoping to improve that. We are adding more direct data export for researchers. So this will be like geodatabases or shapefiles or other types of data. And we hope to increase accessibility by providing like PDF presentations of the data, or other presentations of the data that community groups or government agencies can use directly. All right, so next I'll pass it on to Christopher Lim to demonstrate the air monitoring dashboard.
Thanks, Nico. Let me just close this out and go to the live demo. Okay, so this is the MATES 5 air monitoring data dashboard. It's relatively simple compared to the risk analysis dashboard that Nico just showed, and was made to provide a way for users to easily visualize the air monitoring data that's coming out of MATES 5. So this would be all of the time integrated samples that we're taking. So when the user first opens up this dashboard, they'll see a map with all the 10 MATES sites. If you hover over some of the markers, you'll see some additional information like the address and any kinds of notes. There's some brief instructions and also a glossary to help guide the user use the dashboard. And in order to view the data, User will first interact with these filters on the left. So they'll select an air monitoring station, then a pollutant category, subcategory, and finally the pollutant. Generate the plots. And the first thing that they'll see on the right is a time series of the concentration data for the selected pollutant. Scrolling down will show a weekday versus weekend comparison, and also the average seasonal concentrations. Below that, we're showing some trends across the MATES program. So basically, for the selected pollutant, for each site, you'll see the average concentration over the various MATES programs. So for this pollutant, for calcium, we're showing the concentrations from MATES 3 through MATES 5. And then we have that same trend at the bottom, but for the basin-wide average instead of all the individual sites. Finally, the last thing that we have here is a link to the MATES data download platform. That portal will allow users to download the continuous data, the time integrated data, or also the modeling data from the various MATES programs. Let me stop the share here and I'll go back to the slides. We enlarge this. Perfect, thanks. Thank you. So these are the plans for the MATES 6 air monitoring data dashboard. So basically it will be a recreation of the MATES 5 dashboard that I just showed with some additional components. So again, it will have all of the time integrated data. In terms of the contents, we'll have the time series, the weekday versus weekend comparison, average seasonal concentrations, and the trends across the MATES programs. Obviously open to additional visualizations if people have suggestions. Again, it will allow for the data download. And one thing that we're planning is to simplify this menu structure on the left in order to make it a little bit easier for the users to select the pollutant of interest. One thing that I would like to mention regarding the MATES trends that we were showing on the dashboard is that for MATES 6, for now, the plan is to do a more complete speciation of PM10 versus TSP. 2 sites, Central Los Angeles and Riverside Ruby Dew, will continue TSP metal speciation. However, this previous dashboard tracked trends in concentrations across MATES studies, but those previously measured TSP species might be discontinued. We're still in internal discussions with OEHA in terms of whether we're doing PM10 or TSP, so this is subject to change. And then finally, the big addition to the MATES 6 air monitoring dashboard is the continuous monitoring data. So the plan here is to integrate the continuous monitoring data into this dashboard. We're leaning towards adding it as a separate tab within the larger air monitoring dashboard, since some of these visualizations might be a little bit different. So the dashboard is going to be based on another dashboard that we've developed as part of the AB 617 program. This is this dashboard shown on the right and is something that we use to share data with the public. As for the contents, that will include an hourly time series, average diurnal profile, day of week plots, and seasonal concentrations, and a comparison across sites using box plots. Again, it will allow for data download, and there's a link to the AB 617 continuous air monitoring dashboard here if you would like to take a look. And that I think we're ready to take questions. Nico, did you want to take this slide?
All right, so yeah, some primary questions that we had specifically for the tag So we're developing the health risk assessment, the health risk dashboard using like ArcGIS online tools. I believe the monitoring dashboard is using R-Shiny, or is planned to use R-Shiny, if that's correct. So if there's other, suggestions for software to use, any other suggestions to make these more user-friendly for the general public audience, additional visualizations to include, or other information that we should provide on how to use the tools. Thank you.
Great. So we'll do the same thing. We'll go to the tag first. So go ahead.
Thank you very much. I know this took a lot of work and coordination, so thank you. I don't know if it's available, but a easy way to access this information for the public to know when would be the safest times for them to be outside doing outdoor activities. I know you can't be specific, but especially as we're trying to get people a little bit healthier and keep them safe.
Yeah, so we actually have an air quality index map for that looks at criteria pollutants. So we have that also built into our mobile app, so people can look at that. It provides, it's based on our measurement data of criteria pollutants and then translates that into an air quality index. So it has very clearly defined air quality levels and actions that people can take to protect their health.
Yeah, Don.
Don Collins, UC Riverside. I was wondering if you've thought about the messaging that you might include on this website for when the public views the trends. I believe that there's probably going to be a bump in MATE 6 because of the inclusion of ethylene oxide, and how that information is going to be conveyed to the public about what is being included now and why it's potentially gone up.
I might take that one first. Very good point. I think one of the things we need to see is where OEHA lands on this. I know they're still continuing to evaluate ETO, and we're planning to use OEHA values. Obviously, EPA has its own toxicity values for ETO. I think I'm hoping that's done before that OEHA's work is done before we finish MATES. I'm expecting it probably will be, but you raise a very good point. I think we're just going to have to see where they land on that, because that does make a difference. It can make a difference. Okay. Let's see, Dr. Jarrett.
Thanks. Yeah, I've designed several of these dashboards, and I can see that a tremendous amount of thought and work has gone into this. Just one, and it's good for tracking the progress, but I think having some benchmarking against California and national averages would be good, because the reality is that we've seen a lot of progress, but we're still among the higher locations in California or the US for a lot of these air toxics. So I think that might be of interest to the public to be able to benchmark and see how the trends are compared to statewide or national data.
It's a really good point. One thing I'll note on that too is that if you look at the national air toxics, it's not always apples to apples. How what is being presented there, and that one of the key ones, of course, is diesel, and so there's same way that there might be caveats on ETO, there's probably going to have to be caveats on any kind of benchmarking. But you bring up a good point. How does our area compare to other areas? Yeah, it's a good point.
Thanks.
Okay. Oh yeah, Lakshmi, go ahead. Looks like I think we don't have any other hands raised right now from the tag.
Lakshmi Jairam with Rambol. I'm one of the major users of your MATES 5 data visualization tool. But I have a suggestion for the cancer risk map. If you look at the legend for the MATES 5 cancer risk map, the darkest color is actually the maximum modeled for MATES 4. So when you look at the map, you don't actually see that much of the gradient. So I think it'll be helpful to like reset the legend when you shift from mates 4 to 5. And also it'll be helpful to add maybe like a note at the legend, like maximum model risk. So people understand like what's the max. Just visually, it's easier to see because right now it almost looks all the same, light purple when you go in there.
Appreciate that. I think it's done because you can toggle between the different ones. It's also done on the criteria pollutants map. And so you can see like ozone in the past was considerably higher than it is now. But you raise a good point. If you're just looking only at the one map without the time series, then it smooths it out. You don't quite see the distinctions you're actually looking for. So yeah, good point.
It's nice when you're doing the comparison, but when you're just looking at that snapshot, maybe an option for the user to flip or something like that.
Yep, good point. I see Mei Wu.
Yes. Hi, Mei Wu from OEHA. I have comments on the air monitoring dashboard. I wonder maybe it's helpful to add some brief background information for each pollutant, such as the potential sources and health effects, just briefly, so people know like why they concern about this pollutant, or maybe that help them to interpret the weekday weekend trend, the seasonal trend. So just more helpful for the general users. I have some other comments, minor comments. I'll send them in email. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, May. We'll take that into account. Look forward to your email.
Thank you.
Okay, looks like we have Harvey, your hand is up again on this one, so go ahead.
Hello, am I being heard? Yeah.
Yep, go for it.
My name's Harvey Etter. I'm talking for Public Solar Power Coalition. I neglected to add to the list that I said previously. I also want to know about tracking of PM 2.5, which is a toxic, and my understanding is that 80–90% of the mortalities from air pollution come from that. So now PM is listed as criteria under 10.2.5, but my understanding is it's not listed federally as a toxic. I'd like to put a shout out and confirm that, Scott, etc. And it has the relationship with health. Okay, there's 7,500 deaths is used by the state for emissions deaths for the whole state per year, and they say 2/3 of that, 4,000 or 5,000, is in the district. Okay, but there was a study a few years ago out of Harvard says there's 350,000 deaths in the U.S. per year from air emissions, based on 7 million for the world. And so if we're 12% of the population, we're more up like 50,000. But also there was a Lancet study out of London, 200 years, Lancet Medical Journal, said 1.1 in 18 to 1.5 million premature deaths in the U.S. per year. Okay. If we're 12%, that's 180,000, almost 200,000 deaths on the high, and on the lowest, like 120. We're orders of magnitude above, all right? So, and also there was a study in 13 of 200,000 deaths at MIT from air emissions, and a lot of the higher numbers coming out of here. Anyway, it's important and to make the connections between this, especially with toxics and mortality and morbidity. And if we have 300,000 deaths a year in the state, ballpark, that 2/3 of that, it comes to the higher number from Lancet. If it's half of that, it's still 100,000. In 10 years, that's 1 million deaths. That's premature death. That we know this is going to happen. And we're pushing fossil fuels instead of looking at the Sunshot program, which we brought to the district in 16 plan, etc. So neither the district CARB or EP even evaluated what the Department of Energy was doing with the state of the art and science in solar. And that's how we got to the moon. It was based on the moonshot with Kennedy. All right, so let's get some feedback, please.
Thanks for that, Harvey. So on some of the mortality figures you were citing, I think some of those sounded pretty off, but your main point being that premature death is a significant concern from air pollution. We agree, of course, that's a significant concern. The MATE study really is focused on air toxics, not on the criteria pollutants, but we did show just in this last presentation that the MATES webpage does have, for MATES 5 certainly, and what we're thinking similarly on MATES 6 is another tab to look at criteria pollutants, including PM 2.5, because we do see that it's not just all about one pollutant. So I think we generally agree with you on that, and we're trying to include that sort of comprehensive information that you're raising.
Okay. So 2.5 is not part of MATES now, or recognized as a toxic under federal criteria. Is that correct?
We do monitor PM 2.5 extensively as part of our criteria pollutant monitoring, and we're going to be evaluating species of PM 2.5, the toxic species of PM 2.5. But
is it listed as a federal toxic? Yes or no?
I don't believe it's listed as a hazardous air pollutant. It is a criteria pollutant.
Okay, that's my impression, my understanding as well, and I think that's a grave deficiency.
Okay. Okay. I see. Is that it, Harvey?
Well, I'd like to see, in educating the public, the connection. Well, I want you to check the references that I gave, and we've got more, and also that the connection with the health effects, the health and safety of the people. So, and that the numbers that the state is are not credible. They're way off. And we've got to educate people and obviously staff and ourselves as to what's real and what is not and what we can do about it. Anyway, I see an opportunity here to educate people, and since it's been brought up in the connection between health and toxics, etc., I think it's essential.
Okay.
And I had the first solar education job in the state with Santa Cruz County. I was a solar education specialist in 1977, 78. Anyway.
All right.
So it's dear to me.
Dr. Ang, your hand's raised. Go ahead, Dr. Ang.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Hello?
Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Okay, you can hear me, right?
We can.
Are you aware? I'm going to assume you are, but I think it's worth just saying to everybody that in 2023, there was a major study coming out of New Delhi in India, which said that PM 2.5 shortens the average life expectancy of a New Delhi resident by 12 years. Are you familiar with that study?
That particular study, no, but the fact that there can be effects on lifespan is not surprising.
Yeah, no, I think that one's easy to look up, New Delhi, and what that does show, which is sort of what Harvey Eder said, is that this is something that has as an air pollutant that has a gigantic impact on health, and that's why one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is that the study that you are embarking on, the 4-year study, concentrates on PM10, and yet the presentation by Nick on the health risks all talk about PM 2.5. So I think it may be very important, again, I forgot to say this, that as part of your 4-year study, you have it all arranged to take PM10 in your filter samples. You should intermittently take PM 2.5 samples and evaluate those, and then you can calibrate how much worse PM 2.5 is in terms of their actual toxic amount of whatever is on there. So I forgot to mention that, so I thought I'd mention it here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Aring. Okay, I think I don't see any other hands raised at this point. So we got through a number of things today. Appreciate everybody weighing in and listening to the presentations, thinking through it. There's going to be some follow-up, of course, as we do always afterwards. I do see also, I should mention that there's a few more questions that came through from CARB. I'll just acknowledge we got those questions, thinking about some of the data visualization, some questions for us. We'll take it back, think about it, and we'll circle back with them. And I think we do plan to post all the Q&A that comes through. We do plan to eventually make that available as well in case anybody wants to see those, right? Yes. So with that, I think it's going to be a little bit until we all gather together in a big group like this. So until we see you a year and a half from now, have a great time, but certainly reach out to us at any time. We really appreciate all this interaction. It's definitely going to improve this study. I'm being reminded that we do have one more item, just open discussion. Are there any other items that we should be discussing in MATES that are related to MATES that we haven't talked about so far that anybody wants to raise? All right, seeing none. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks to all the staff for pulling all this together. And until next time, thank you.
Thank you.